I'd like to take you through the afternoon session. We're going to be talking about best practice policies on energy efficiency. I'm going to talk first generally about the cross-sectoral best practice policies on energy efficiency. Then you'll hear from Fawkes on best practices on the industrial side. And then Yamina is going to be talking about experience from the EU climate and energy policy package. So this presentation is based on a recent publication in 2015 called Best Policy Practices for Promoting Energy Efficiency. And I do have a handful of these publications if you're interested after the webinar. And I guess it's a publication that was done jointly between the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. I talked before about our involvement with the group of experts in energy efficiency, and this is a publication from that group of experts in energy efficiency. So it's a partnership between UNECE and the Copenhagen Centre on Energy Efficiency. And really, it's got 4 chapters. It's a structured framework, so it looks at investment imperative of energy efficiency, identifying best practice policies, high impact policies and measures, and then how you implement these, implementing the menu, so developing and implementing these best practice policies. So there are 4 chapters, and I guess the question is, how do you identify whether or not they're actually best practice policies? And I guess we were looking at sort of 4 attributes: whether they had a significant outcome, were they complementary, political alignment, whether they align with other efforts governments are doing, and the marketability and market impact. But this is an important component that sometimes gets overlooked, but to get full participation in energy efficiency policies, you need to market it, you need to get people engaged, the private sector, and all key stakeholders. So there's some of the lenses that when we're analysing some of these best practice policies that we were looking at in this publication. So you'll see some assessment of sectoral policies cutting across all these different attributes. And why have we identified them? They've been included because they've been through some sort of policy review. They've been through improvement cycles, so they've been for a number of years and they've been improved over time. They've been recognising international reviews, and they've survived over time, so they've got some longevity about them. So what does this structured framework look like? It does have a foundation of, I'm not going to go into the details. What I'd like to do is give you some examples of the type of policies that fall under these. So we're saying that a good foundation of governance and finance policies. So we're talking about having enabling frameworks, having national strategies, plans and targets, having institutional arrangements. So having an institution that's responsible for energy efficiency is absolutely critical. And if there's a number of energy efficiency institutions that they're coordinated and working together, involving cities and regions, and having good data and statistics. We talked about that earlier, how important it is to have good data available. And in relation to, say, finance, so government and leveraged loans finance, involving ESCOs, funds guarantees, risk sharing arrangements, tax incentives, rebates, grants, and international climate finance. So there's a whole range of different types of forms for other things to build on. If you don't have the governance and finance, then you're really going to struggle. Certainly utility policies are important, things like utility cost-reflective pricing, regulatory mandates, utility ESCOs, utility white certificates, finance for utility energy efficiency, and voluntary programs. And then on top of that, household policies for energy efficiency. So you heard Cassini talk before about building energy efficiency. We know insulation is important, retrofits for existing homes. Building codes is important, and minimum energy performance standards. Certification programs. In this we also include standards and labelling programs for equipment and appliances that we know are very effective. Endorsement labels like Energy Star, efficient lighting. And then we've got other policies in relation to transport, fiscal policies for transport, passenger light vehicle fuel economy standards we know work very well, heavy duty vehicle economy standards, eco driving, and public transport and low energy modes. And the third pillar that builds on the governance, finance and utility policies is industry energy policies. And I mentioned earlier about energy management systems, so the ISO 50001, having action in commercial buildings, capacity building, small and medium enterprises, voluntary agreements and industry innovation. So that's just a summary. You can find more detail in the publication, but that's the sort of structured framework that we think covers across all sectors. Now this is just way too detailed, but it looks at those four, this is how it's presented in the publication, looking at the 4 different attributes and analysing a particular policy. So in this case, existing home insulation weatherisation. So it looks at the different attributes and assesses that policy, and then it provides some brief examples of where a country's been assessed as having sort of best practice policies in this. So you can see Netherlands had a revolving fund for housing energy efficiency. New Zealand had a grant for more energy efficient buildings, and also talked about what we talked earlier about the multiple benefits of having more efficient and more a warmer household. So here they talked about the health benefits coming from having insulating buildings. So that's how they sold to the government, and that was a very successful program. And then Korea, which is, as I mentioned, something being done by the Energy Charter. They did a lot of work on cogeneration and district heating. So that's how the publication is set up. So it's got lots of case studies, briefly talks about each of the case studies, where it's working well, and then provides some additional information if you're interested in terms of finding out more about what they're doing. Just a couple of examples of some of the a bit deeper on the governance, examples of cross-sectoral policies in relation to governance. So Estonia had a National Energy Efficiency Action Plan. It was found to be ambitious and effectively balanced, and covered off the key sectors using data and information to make sure that they were targeting both the policies and the finance options that really address the issues in Estonia. And also the coordination mechanisms in Switzerland was important. There was the national government, but there was also jurisdictional, which they call cantonal governments, and they're really working together. They're shared responsibility for some things, but then there's the federal government's got jurisdiction over vehicles and appliances, where cantons have coverage over buildings. So we know buildings is a thermal shell, and it's got equipment and appliances in there. So it needs to be that both the national governments and the cantonal governments are working together, and that was an example in Switzerland of how that's working effectively together. In relation to finance, and Steve and I were talking before how important it is to make sure there's lots of really good examples of how finance works to support energy efficiency. We talked before about bankable projects. There's certainly government funding and credit lines. The example in the publication is in relation to Germany, KfW, providing government funding for government deep renovation and construction of low energy buildings. So really, leading by example, and also providing low interest loans to entice the development of low energy buildings, and providing euros of 2 billion per year. Then there's examples also from Thailand that are a revolving fund to provide zero interest rates to improve energy efficiency, and so that had some big impacts in Thailand. So it's not examples of the developed world, but also the developing and emerging economies too. So we've tried to get a range of examples in this publication to show that it's these sort of things are happening at lots of levels. Then in terms of industry, nets for industrial equipment, we know that motors and fans and other industrial equipment use a lot of energy. So the EU Eco Design Directive had a focus on industrial products and focus on the most energy intensive industrial products to minimise their energy use and life cycle costs. And there were some good examples of how that led to energy demand reductions over time, quite significant numbers, and it's also helped push the development and innovation in relation to industrial equipment. And certainly transport, we know that fuel economy standards have worked very well in many countries, and certainly in the EU, the vehicle fuel economy standard have to meet 130 grams of CO2 by 2015. We're already seeing, as that policy is coming into place, the share of those low fuel cars coming into play in Spain. So they're having some good effects. But we know that these fuel economy standards is very successful. The other one that we're all very familiar with, and I see Jenny from CLASP here, everyone knows how important, how successful these standards and labelling programs have been around the world. They're often the first policy that a government puts in place when they're wanting to improve energy efficiency. They often can pick up the existing regulations and standards in place and adopt them in their country. It just means they can keep these inefficient products coming into their countries. And this is particularly important for countries where they're importing diesel fuel to generate electricity. And it's often more important to import more efficient air conditioners and fridges and freezers than it is to import diesel fuel. So they've been really successful over time, and there's been lots of evaluations to show just how important having standards, labels and endorsement labels can really help reduce the energy use in the industrial, residential and commercial sectors. Really impressive benefits over time. And in those well-established programs have shown that that doesn't necessarily increase the price of equipment over time. And again, I've got a point there about the multiple benefits. You can sell this to your governments to say there's many benefits over going to your country in relation to jobs savings, and there's some numbers there for the US. So some of the questions, obviously, when you're thinking about best practice policies for your country, there's, you can see there's best practice policies, but you can't necessarily just pick up a policy and dump it in your country. You do have to modify, adapt, and think about what's important in your country. So identifying your country's socio-economic priorities are important. Why are these priorities? What hold them back? How can energy efficiency policies help? And what step will get commitment to these policies? And that steps, commitment from government, from the private sector, from financiers, and all stakeholders, civil society, so that these energy efficiency policies can come into play. There's lots of questions to help shape what's important in your country. An energy efficiency strategy, we need national strategies, targets, action plans to realise this ambition and commitment and turn that into action. We need to shape these to national priorities and sector priorities, and public consultations is really important. I talked before about the importance of having a good market strategy to sell the strategy to the people that are going to be affected. And tracking and evaluating success is important to further expand your program. So, monitoring evaluation is absolutely critical. You need to review regularly, celebrate success and progress, and update and extend your activities. So I talked about this publication. I focused a lot on that, but we have talked before earlier today about this. I think Cindy mentioned the IEA's Policies and Measures database. The World Energy Council have also got a database. There's the Odyssey Mule database. And there's good practice guides in C40 cities, so there's a lot of information out there. So I think this publication serves as a guide, but there's lots of resources out there that you can see who's come before you and learn from mistakes that may have been made and good practices. And I think it's a really good databases out there to use. So that's it from me. I think what we'll do is take questions at the end, if that's okay. So I'll ask Stephen to come up and talk about best practice policies for improving energy efficiency in the industry sector. Okay, so next time.
So I will take off my ICP hat, put my other hats on. So Tim asked me to talk about best practices and case studies for industrial energy efficiency improvement, and I suppose do a bit of a plug for this book that we wrote with Copenhagen Center for Energy Efficiency, which was really designed to help policymakers develop either new policies or improve policies for industry and improving energy efficiency in industry. I'm not going to go into details about specific policies. I think you need to read the book if you're interested. I'm just going to highlight the key kind of topics and areas for policy that we talked about. So first of all, it's a very good definition of modern world. I suppose industrial society can be viewed as a complex machine for degrading high quality energy into waste heat while creating an enormous catalogue of goods and services. Great description written in 1971. So why industry? Why is industry important? Well, if you look globally, industry accounts for 29% of energy use. And energy intensity everywhere in industry is falling, but it's not falling as quickly as we need it to fall. Also, if you think about industry from a policymaker's point of view, it's sort of easier to deal with industry in some ways because you have a limited number of fairly big users, whereas in transport or residential you have millions of users, all of whom are quite small. Also, as we said earlier, that if you look at any country in any sector, you get this huge range, probably 2 or 3 to 1, between the best performing industry or best performing enterprise in that sector and the worst. And some of that is due to vintage, when plants went in, but a lot of it is down to energy management, quality, and so on. So there's a big scope to just reduce that big spread of performance. Okay, so I'm preaching to the converted here, so I don't need to talk about why energy efficiency. Statement from the G8 ministers, prime ministers, whatever leaders. I think the really important thing about energy efficiency, which we touched on before, is obviously security and environmental issues, but also the non-energy benefits. And I think it's becoming more and more recognized that the non-energy benefits are probably more interesting to end-user decision makers than some of the energy savings. Those of us who are in the energy efficiency business always put energy savings high up the list, but actually if you're running a retail store or you're running a factory, the strategic non-energy benefits are actually much, much more interesting and important, and we need to start valuing them and build them into policy. We also, if you're thinking about policymakers, you have to recognize that energy efficiency policy presents some real problems for policymakers. My favorite one is what I call the ribbon problem, which is it's very hard to have your photograph taken cutting a ribbon in front of a big energy efficiency project. Much easier to have your photograph taken in front of a wind turbine or solar panel array or some big new energy supply option. So, energy efficiency is difficult for policymakers for lots of reasons, that being one. Secondly, it's lots of small projects, very hard to aggregate into big amounts of money, as we said earlier. And also it's sort of invisible. Measurement and verification aside, it's still invisible to politicians. So it's actually quite difficult. And also fundamentally, I think if you look in any government, there is a supply side bias. That's just a historical, traditional thing that evolved for the historical reasons. And as we know, if you look at the US Department of Energy or the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change, 50% of the budget is dealing with nuclear cleanup and all that stuff anyway. So departments of energy very often are dominated by supply side people, so there's a real bias there, and policy makers who really want to do something about this stuff have to overcome that bias. But the benefits are huge. Numbers from the productivity study. If we doubled energy productivity, it's worth about 2 trillion globally and 6 million jobs. And I can't remember what the 2 trillion equates to, but it's something like the US, Canada, Mexico GDP. It's a big number anyway. Okay, so measurement is vital, and it's kind of cliche. Anybody who hasn't read Peter Drucker should always read Peter Drucker. Absolutely genius management consultant, educator, and author. Kind of forgotten a bit these days, but you have to measure something to improve it, and that applies at the enterprise level when you're doing energy management, but it applies at the policy level. So putting in place the right measurements of policy effectiveness is really important. Okay, removing barriers to energy efficiency is a lot smarter and cheaper than trying to get millions of individuals over these barriers. There's a lot of talk about barriers to energy efficiency. One of them is the whole supply side bias in government. Another one is it's not seen as strategic in businesses, which goes back to my point about non-energy benefits. Non-energy benefits are much more strategic very often than energy efficiency. So, and then other barriers like lack of data and lack of standardization, and we talked about lack of data earlier. There is a real lack of data on how this stuff works, and if you're a policymaker, that gives you a problem, even if you want to do something. So we need to focus really on barriers rather than trying to get people over barriers. We need to take the barriers down. So information, again, in the energy efficiency world for decades, talk about getting information out there, dissemination of information, awareness, all this stuff. But data is not information, information is not knowledge, and knowledge is not understanding, etc., etc. So I think, how do you get information out and build capacity in decision making really needs to be central to policy. And kind of some really good examples of this which we brought out in the publication. Ireland has the large industrial energy network which brings together about 60 or 70 industrials within Ireland, which in total account for about 17% of Ireland's energy use. And by bringing them together, networking, focusing on certain issues for a certain period of time, that really helped to build capacity, and there's been some really significant energy savings coming out of that. Product labeling is another area that's informational based, and obviously training of energy managers, training of non-specialists, those kind of things, really important to have information based. But giving information on its own is not enough. And information has to be in the context of that decision maker that you're trying to influence. So again, some good examples that we brought out in the book, like the Better Buildings, Better Plants program in the US, and a few others. So legal and regulatory policies was the other area that we talked about in the book. And clearly with legal and regulatory policies, you can either ban things or you can make people do things, kind of classic legal policies. And examples that we had included sort of agreement programs where you get industries to agree to targets. Things like the ESOS in the UK, which is the Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme, which grew out of the Energy Efficiency Directive. That is an example of a regulatory policy which is starting to have an effect. And actually, incidentally, the good thing about UK policy, this is a rare example of good UK policy power, on ESOS, they said the report has to go in front of the signed off, which was in advance of what the directive said. So we were ahead of the directive in that case. And then MEPS. Tim mentioned MEPS, Minimum Energy Performance Standards. Motors, particularly for industry, is really critical area, and obviously some countries, some jurisdictions have legislation. And then other things that are regulatory programs, other examples that we brought out, like the China top 1,000 and top 10,000 enterprises, where those enterprises had to do certain things. Now, clearly, the culture and the what you can do varies from countries to countries. What's acceptable in China may not be acceptable here. And thinking you were mentioning air conditioning nets made me think of the Saudi Arabia example. I'm doing some work in Saudi at the moment. When they introduced MEPS on air conditioning, they didn't just say, that's the rule, just carry on. They went to every warehouse with air conditioning in, took out all the air conditioning units that were below the MEPS, and steamroller over them, crush them in public on television. So acceptable in Saudi, but maybe not acceptable elsewhere. I've got my £50 note again. I forgot I had that twice today. Sorry. So you already know the story on the £50 notes. Fiscal and financial policies really important. You know, fiscal policies like tax, you can increase taxes, and there are examples of that, or you can give tax breaks like enhanced capital allowances in the UK, although I understand that's being challenged by Brussels. We'll see what happens in a week or so. And then public funding, grant schemes and so on, examples of those. And then also examples of energy efficiency funds, a few of which were mentioned earlier. You know, we have examples from Argentina, Mexico, China, Philippines of different funds. But I think my word of caution on energy efficiency funds, as I said earlier, talking about ICP, is just providing money doesn't make it happen. You need to create demand for those funds. So fiscal, financial funds, and there's a lot more emphasis on those, particularly moving from public funding to private funding. Technology innovation policies was the other area that we looked at. You know, innovation, lots of talk about innovation. Personally, I think, and I love innovation, I'm an engineer and I love technology, but it's kind of overplayed because we know that if we only applied all the technology that we have that's economic, we'd be making a huge difference. But, you know, there is a place for new technology, and clearly different policies can be put in place to encourage innovation. In the UK, we have Innovate UK, which gives out grants. Again, tax structures and tax policies are quite useful for innovation technology. I think, as I say, overall innovation is kind of overplayed because we need to apply what we've got, but clearly there is a place for encouraging innovation. And I think it's not just technology innovation, it's business model and business practice innovation that we need to encourage. Okay, so those are the four kind of main areas of policy that we covered, where we found examples and best practices, as I say, information-led and capacity building, fiscal and financial policies, innovation policies, and institutional, regulatory, and legal policies. And I think then towards the end of the book, we pulled it together with some examples covering Malaysia, India, and elsewhere, where they'd actually integrated all of these. And I think that's a really important message. You have to pull all those things together and wrap that up in a sort of measurement of effects and measurement of results as well. So that's the guide, the best practices in case studies for industrial energy efficiency improvement. If you haven't read it, read it. I'm promoting my book, but I don't get any revenue from this, these guys, so I can do a book plug for it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. We might take questions at the end again. So I'll invite Yamina up. Talking about experience from the EU, climate and energy policy management.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation. So what I will present is the work that I'm doing. So there is no report yet available to that, but it's based on previous work I have done when I was at the European Commission to joint research set, part of it only. So for the audience, I think is not only European, so that's why I did back up a little bit. So in the EU, we have in 2007 agreed on what we call the 3-20-20 targets, which is the greenhouse gas emission target, 20%, binding target at the EU and national level, the 20% renewable targets, and the indicative target, which is not binding target, for energy efficiency. And to make sure that we will meet these three targets, so the EU developed a set of policies, directives, regulations, etc. Here you have a list of almost all what is related to climate and energy, to meet climate and energy 2020 targets. And when we look at this, so we have, for example, these are the climate ones, this part. so to meet the 2020 climate part. And the EU ETS is binding at the EU level. And then we have the effort sharing decision regulation that the energy efficiency people are not used to look to this regulation. Why we should be looking to this regulation? Because this is binding, but it's binding at national level. And for example, building, transport are included here. So what does happen is that the ETS covers 45% of our emissions, and ESD covers 55% of our emissions. And I will just focus a bit on buildings because what I'm doing these days. And the member states meet, they decide, they agree on how to share this effort because it's based on national circumstances. And for the ESD, member states with high GDP, they have to make extra effort compared to member states with low GDP to avoid to compromise their development. And then we have, but overall what this means in terms of measures, it's basically maximum CO2 emissions in one sector or overall economy. And then we have, for transport, we have specific regulation that regulates maximum CO2 emissions as well. But we also have, everywhere, we have a label to provide information to the end user. So one policy measure that we use that seems to be successful is this maximum emission or maximum energy consumption or minimum energy performance requirement. And the other one is to provide information. And then we have also part the way we reach our ETS target is through the renewable directive, because the renewable directive requires member states to meet 20%, to have 20% of the power generation the power generation from renewables. And then we have for efficiency, what most people here are interested. We usually look at the energy efficiency directive, which includes, we have Article 3 in this directive, the indicative target, the 20% indicative target that we have to meet. So member states are not required under Article 3 to have sectoral targets. But in practice, based on the reporting that what was made by a member state, 2/3 of member states took the initiative. It was recommended, but 2/3 took the initiative to report on the sectoral targets. And then it's interesting because when you have the sectoral target, then you can go back, because here for ESD, we have sectoral projections. I will show you the projections for ESD. So then you can compare what is going to be done from energy efficiency side in terms of energy demand, and what is going to be, what they expect to have from carbon perspective, from greenhouse gas emission perspective. And when you have these two, then they don't match, and we have an issue, because they don't all match. And then we usually think, when we think about energy efficiency, we have one directive for one sector, building sector, the Energy Performance Directive. The major issue in Europe is existing buildings. Unfortunately, the Energy Performance Directive doesn't target existing buildings, targets only new buildings. For existing buildings, there is only, if major renovation is conducted, then you need to meet minimum energy performance requirement. But the way major renovation is defined means that most of the buildings, especially in the residential sector, can be renovated without having to meet energy performance requirement. So basically, this directive doesn't help in terms of the major issue that we have, which is existing buildings. And then for product policies, we have eco-design that sets minimum energy performance requirement, and we have a labeling directive that provides information. So in addition to that, we have, for all sectors, we have various financial schemes, and all our financial schemes are the investment policy in Europe and the energy efficiency, what we are not really used to look at these policies. We are used to look at only the minimum energy performance requirement, actually, which I think today is wrong. And then in terms of financing scheme, today we know because the last 2 years, member states had to report on what they were doing. So most of the financing scheme are grants. So to kickstart implementing the measures, energy efficiency measures, to build capacity, grants could be a good tool. But now we are in a situation where we learned a lot, thanks to 2020 package, but we have most of these instruments since 2007, and some of them, the PPD, we have it since 2002. So now we need to move to the next step, because the grants do not allow, first, the grants make energy efficiency a burden for public expenditures. That's an issue, while energy efficiency is an opportunity for the economy. So in the current context, when some people are against energy efficiency, they use this as an argument. Second, with grants, we cannot finance, for example, deep renovation. It's not possible because it's too costly. So, all this to say that we have, when you look at it like that, there are two ways to see that. We have comprehensive policy package, this is what they do here. But you can also say that we have patchwork and it's completely fragmented, which is also true. So it's both at the same time. But it was a learning experience because Europe is the only region, I think, in the world. Before that, I was at the IEA, so I was looking to all countries, at least OECD countries. Europe is the only region in the world where we have this comprehensive package all at the same time, even if we were designed at different periods, so we were not all the time checking consistencies. And this is what Europe is doing now, actually. So we are in different phase. And then, so this is 2020. I will not focus too much on 2020, because we are already in working on 2030. 2020, we have only 3 years left. And we are not going to change what is in these policies now for 2020. So in 2030, for 2030, in 2014, the EU leaders agreed on, so the Commission has a model that the Commission runs, DG Energy runs, and then based on this, the Commission proposed 3 different scenarios for energy savings and for greenhouse gas emission. So the decision was first taken that greenhouse gas emission for 2030 will be reduced by 40% compared to 1990. And then after that, another department in the Commission had to run the same model to look at how much energy savings do we need to reach 40% greenhouse gas emissions. So it was done in 2 different steps. I don't think it's ideal. And then finally, our leaders agreed on 27% energy savings. So to reach by 2020, this is what had been agreed. By 2030, 27% energy savings compared to the projections of the baseline. And then there is, in the communication that we have, it says that it's 27%, but it might be reviewed by 2020, and we may go to 30%. And then there is another scenario, possible scenario, which is 40% energy savings. But this is what the Parliament called for, and then we come back why it is important to look at all the scenarios at the same time. So we have actually, in all the rest of my presentation, we will all the time see these 3 scenarios plus the reference scenario with the current policies. So what did happen? That was in September 2014. In February 2015, something completely new happened in Europe. Well, we had the new Commission elected, I think, in September. And then February 2015, the new Commission proposed the Energy Union Policy Package Strategy Framework. And the Energy Union Strategy Framework included something that is really revolutionary, where we are called to rethink energy efficiency and consider it as an energy source in its own. This is completely new, completely revolutionary. It doesn't exist in any other place, except one state in the US, Vermont. And then I put it in green because I will show you that I think it's already done. It's already in our estimates for 2030. We can consider it as an energy source. But then, because this year, 2016, is an exceptional year in Europe, we are revising or reviewing most of our EU, all the instruments that you have seen. They are under revision now. They have to be reviewed. So the Commission is working on new proposals, how to update them for 2030. And then, in the same paper, the Commission says that the Commission will make sure that energy efficiency and demand side, this is the sum. The sum of the 2 is the energy savings, will compete in fair manner with generation capacity. I think it was in your presentation that you were saying that in the UK 50% of the Department of Energy goes to the conventional resources, and there's not too much left for other ones. So, and this is not yet done, but we don't know how to do it. It's part of the review process that we have today. And this is really something completely new. But if you look at now, I try to apply the wording or to explain the wording of the Energy Union with figures, actually using the figures of the Commission. So these are the scenarios that we have. This is if we do nothing, we just the proposals that we have today. This is what we have agreed, what we may have, and this is what the Parliament wanted. So usually the energy unit, since we learned it at school, it's just we have those, well, when I was at school, I learned this a lot in Europe, but maybe not for everyone. We usually had only fossil fuels plus nuclear, and then we had renewables, right? Now, if I translate the Energy Union paper into words, and one thing that we need to notice is that here, in this case, you have oil is resilient. So by 2030, oil will stay the first fuel of Europe. It's the case, and all our oil, most of it, is important. The other thing that is not moving the model that needs to be corrected is that you see here when we increase the efficiency, the share of in terms of the absolute figure for renewables decreases because it's just a balance in the model actually, which is something that we need to correct in terms of modeling. Most of the models work in this way. The IA model works like that as well. And then what is important in the case of Europe is that all this part, the most important part, is not in our it's not European energy source. So our energy dependency is around 53%, and it's going to stay around 53% by 2030. So with all the efforts that we are making, we will still be dependent for almost half, more than half of our for our energy. Now, what I do is that I keep exactly the same graph. The only difference is that I added here the energy savings that have been calculated for different scenarios. These are the savings in the current policies, and then the additional one if we increase the adopt one of the scenarios. And the difference, because they are savings, so it's source of energy, but it's not consumed, so I put it in negative part. And the surprise is that by doing this, what I have, you see this block, this is energy savings and renewables. This is domestic production, European domestic production of energy. And it's higher than all fossil fuels together. So if we look at your energy savings indifferently as an energy source, as it's stated in the Energy Union, so the energy savings will be in each of the scenarios, this part will be higher than oil actually. So we will first view, and in this scenario, that's why this scenario is very important, it's the only scenario where we have the sum of energy savings and renewables overtake the sum of all fossil fuels, which are imported of course. But it's not the scenario that we have today. And then when we look at more in details the scenarios, so what we have, the scenarios that the Commission did run, they are mainly based for the building sector actually. The Commission expects an increase of renovation rate over time, and this renovation rate will make the building sector, which is today in terms of end-use sectors, one of the most emitting sectors, will be the less emitting sector actually. So this is what we see. We see here decreasing the consumption of the building sector, building sector is low, and it is reflected in terms of emissions. Surprisingly, one of the sectors that is not at all well treated in the sector in the scenarios, the red one is the transport sector. So transport sector is the only sector where we had an increase of emissions between 1990 and 2030. It's the only sector among all the sectors. But surprisingly, we don't expect to have a decrease of the emissions. So the transport sector will be the highest emitter and use sector. And this is because the model doesn't take into account the urban transport, etc. So it's still, in Europe, we have more than 70% of the population goes to work by individual car, actually. And so the only policy that we have is the CO2 emission for cars, which is not enough. So we need to go beyond in terms of modeling. This is what it means actually. But then the other thing that we need to keep in mind, so all these scenarios is what the Commission has done to set these targets. But then in parallel to that, member states, under the effort sharing decision, they report to the Commission their projections for 2030. So we don't have the reporting for energy consumption for 2030. On voluntary basis reported by sector, they are not required. But for greenhouse gas emission, they are required to report on their projections for all sectors for 2030 and I think it is 2035. And when you compare this, so the red part is what member states are projecting. So for each sector, you have industry, transport, and buildings. The interesting thing is that, as I showed before, so buildings, these are the Commission scenarios. This is the green one is if we do nothing, we just current policies. This is 27%, 30, 40. So we see that the building sector, you see it's really, we reduce it by a lot. But then, when you compare it to what member states are projecting, the sum, then you see that even with 27% target, current target, we are, we're 23%. Member states, the sum member state projection is 23% higher than the current EU target actually. So we have an issue. And if we go to 40%, it's more than double actually if you compare the two. So the only, and the same for transport as well. So you see transport, it's not really reduced now. It's almost the same everywhere in all the scenarios. And of course, member states' projections for transport are higher than what we have on Paris model. And the same for industry. So we really have an issue between the projections that member states are doing for their 2030 carbon emissions, and probably to do that they would have done, I think they have probably done their projections for energy, but we don't have these figures. They are not publicly available. And sorry, an important point is that these figures that I put for member states are the figures with the additional measures that they are planning. Because member states report on greenhouse gas emission in two ways, with additional measures, with the current measures. So this already includes these additional measures. I don't know what's that, but they already included that. So, so that was the first reason why we need to go for more stringent targets. The other one is that what did happen, end of 2015, we had this climate Paris agreement. All the work that was done at the Commission, this 2020, 2030 target, was with the perspective to be at 2 degrees, actually, the EU contribution to be at 2 degrees. What is completely new is that since December, we have signed for this, at least our leaders signed for 1.5 degrees. So what does that mean? Technically, it means that all that we have done needs to be updated to be at 1.5 degrees. And we don't have yet the data for 1.5 degrees. No one knows. The IPCC didn't publish the data. But I have done something that modelers do not like, but just to illustrate. So what I did is that these are the EU scenarios. So here we are 40% less than greenhouse gas emission in 1990. If we go for 40% energy savings, we will be at 44% for greenhouse gas emission. But even with 44% greenhouse gas emission, we are above the IA estimate for Europe contribution to be at 2 degrees. Well, of course, the IA model cannot be compared to the Commission model. And of course, the assumptions are different. Just for indication, why we use the IA data? Because the IA gives a global perspective, actually, while for the EU model, it gives only the EU perspective. So, because we are not, you cannot really compare the data, we could say that we are in the same order of magnitude here. So it was acceptable before Paris. But I don't think it's acceptable now we have Paris. Because now that, now that we have Paris, we don't have this figure. This is just a figure that I use like that, because I think that, logically, whatever this figure will be, it will be lower than the IA estimate to be at 2 degrees. It will be lower than this. Our emissions should be lower. It doesn't matter how much is this figure. That's for illustration. So I put this. So we are getting far away from Paris. More. So it's really clear that we cannot just stay with 27% actually. We cannot stay with our current target, even if we have comprehensive package, etc. But at the same time, as I showed at the beginning, the renewable target is put a little bit on competition with energy savings. So it's something that we need to fix in the model, and we probably need to combine. It's not enough to increase the efficiency target. We also need to increase the renewable target, actually. We need to increase both targets to be in the Paris, in line with Paris. So what I think, what's next for Europe? We need to align our 2030 climate and energy targets with Paris Agreement, because if we don't align with Paris Agreement, I think train is going and we will miss the train, actually. And actually, when I say we miss the train, we miss the innovation train. Because one important thing that did happen in Paris was Bill Gates' call for innovation, for investment in innovation, that it seems Europe is a bit outside this call, actually. We are out. It's mainly China and the US. So we should not miss this innovation train. And then we need to make sure that the Commission projections, as I showed, are coherent with member states' projections, because you cannot on one hand say you are going to reach 40% savings, and on the other hand, when you see member states' projections, they are far from 40%. I think that one of the reasons why we have this mismatch is because we have all these instruments. As I said at the beginning, you could say that it's very comprehensive, etc. But it's also very difficult to assess the coherence between the provisions, and sometimes we have contradictions, especially when I start looking to investment policies. So there are some investment policies, some rules in the investment in state aid, for example, that hinder investment in energy efficiency. So it's not coherent actually. So we need something more coherent that goes beyond climate and energy targets to include an investment what is in the investment policies. And the OECD developed what is called a green investment framework for low carbon resilient infrastructure. So this theoretical framework includes all the components that should avoid the inconsistencies that we have today. And then we should not forget that the Energy Union paper, it introduced two new principles. Energy saving is fuel. The other one, making sure that energy saving compete in fair manner with generation capacity. Because if we have this, then we will have the money flowing to energy efficiency and to renewables. That's it, I think. So you will have a presentation available on this website.
Thank you.
Okay.
Second shot, welcome to take some questions. Any questions out there? Yes.
I'm wondering, so the 27% targets include transportation. Yeah. What would your graph look like if you were only focusing on buildings? It would be much better if I have only buildings. If I look at it only from the EC perspective, yes. But then when I compare it to the member state perspective, then I have plenty of questions because they don't match actually. The difference for buildings, between the Commission, 27%, and the member states is 23% greenhouse gas emissions. You have 23% more with member states projections. This I know, I did this calculation. And if you go to the 40% target, energy saving target, then you have member state emission projections are more than double than the Commission projections for 40% targets. You're welcome. Sorry? Currently, we have plenty of obstacles. Currently, the situation is very bad. I think one way, because a lot of people talk about multiple benefit, and this project was born when I was at the IEA. It was born as a result of interviews conducted by one of my colleagues, Eleonore, and she was helping me with the building, trying to see what's going on buildings in different countries. And Eleonore, she's not at all an energy efficiency expert. She came to see me, she said, no one knows what you are doing, what you are talking about, Yamina. And then I told her, really? And then I told her, okay, what people are talking about in all our countries, in OECD countries. She came back, she said, they talk about jobs, growth, and sometimes they talk about construction. But no one has, I didn't see the word energy efficiency. This is how the multiple benefit project was born. So I don't think we can sell energy efficiency as a standalone concept. You cannot sell it, it's just not saleable actually. But I do think that it's saleable if we put it in terms of innovation, jobs, and growth. Because today, otherwise Europe is going to be, because I am looking to technologies and innovation, Europe is already lagging behind the US, Japan, Korea in most advanced technologies actually, for example, automation, etc. There are a lot of technologies where we are lagging behind. So if we continue like that, we may become a developing country very soon, and it goes very fast actually. And I think the way to sell it is that the decarbonization scenario will drive innovation because technologies we have today do not allow to decarbonize enough to go with the Paris Agreement. We don't have technology for the Paris Agreement. So the more stringent are our target, our national target, our domestic target, the more there will be need for innovation. And if you have a need for innovation, so you have creativity and you have jobs and growth. And in this case, we could sell it. And in this case, we could achieve more than 40% actually. That's my answer.
I think the
critical thing there, maybe slightly different on innovation. But the critical thing is about selling non-energy benefits, because that's what makes decision makers take decisions. And I can think of certain cities in the US, cities that are not well-known cities that have done an awful lot, because decision makers have said, I care about economic development, I care about fuels, and I care about importing fuel. They don't necessarily care about energy efficiency, and they almost certainly don't care about climate. Some do, some don't. So that side. I think the other important point in the presentation was how do you make energy efficiency like other energy resources? And that's about, to my mind, it's about creating a market for energy efficiency, which we do not have at the moment. For 40 years, we've had energy efficiency programmatic, driven by kind of policy, public money, or mandate. And we need to get away from that and make a market. We don't have a market for energy efficiency, we have a market for stuff, like insulation or LEDs. There is no market for energy efficiency, so therefore the question becomes, how do you create one? And that's where the Californian legislation, the most recent legislation, is really interesting, because it's about how do you measure energy efficiency and make it a resource just like any other resource. And if you can crack that problem, which is kind of based around advanced measurement verification, then you end up with a financeable resource that looks just like any other financeable resource. And I believe that if we went down that way, everybody would be surprised by how much there is out there.
You are
you make it a market and you make it a revenue generating thing
Exactly.
rather than a saving thing. You'll be amazed how much there is.
So when the Mutual Benefit Project was born at the IEA, at the same time was born the project of Energy Efficiency Market Report that the IEA is publishing since 2013. It was the same year that the two projects were born. And they were born exactly for this reason. I checked, and they will have this report available next week, I think, the market for energy renovation, for example. So based on US methodology, because we didn't have an EU methodology for that, my estimate of the energy innovation market in 2015 is 109 billion actually. But then I checked the details from where this money is coming. And actually most of it, it's not really an energy, it's not self-sustained market. It's a subsidized market, and subsidized market is not a market actually. It's with our taxes, so we cannot do it. We cannot do it forever. We cannot go too deep in the energy innovation. And because then I checked all the policies that would have generated this market, and most of them are grants actually, and they were based. And it's interesting that when we look at member states' reply, they didn't. Basically, the motivation was in 2009. 2008 we had the crisis. 2009 member states implemented recovery measures, economic recovery measures to avoid an economic downturn actually. And the economic part of the economic recovery measures was to provide grants for energy innovation actually. So it is a subsidized market with the idea of the economic recovery. It's not really, first, it's not a self-sustained market. Second, it's not for energy efficiency that it was done. It was just one way to do it. And at the same time, of course, member states, they say, at the same time, this allowed us to meet our 2020 targets. So it's just an accessoire 2020 targets. That was the economic.
Everybody was free to complete and relying on markets, well, I do hesitate. With our experience and recent schemes in which we created a market mechanism in renewable energy or certificate schemes, there are some limitations to market mechanisms. And especially when we talk about energy efficiency projects, actually the energy efficiency obligations, the idea is to create a market, but you have components creating energy efficiency, the marketable, spreadable component. But the processes that create the tradable components, they do differ, very different, they do differ to a significant extent. And well, that makes a market mechanism challenging.
It's certainly challenging, yeah, but it's not been tried really. There is no market for energy efficiency. I can't phone up my power broker and buy a 5-year strip of energy efficiency. I can phone up my power broker and buy a 5-year strip of power. So there is no market for efficiency.
That's true. only
buy
subsidized.
5 years of power and then I can go through a whole hassle of buying a whole load of insulation and light bulbs and all that stuff. That's not a market for energy efficiency.
I like your quote about, how did you call it, dilemma?
Yeah.
Driven problem, yeah.
Yeah, because now that's the success of photovoltaics in my point of view. It's so visible.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely contributes to it.
Yeah.
But there isn't really a market for PV as a subsidy market. That doesn't change.
And vice versa of the cogeneration plants, the cogeneration, there we are. They have a
Yeah.
it has a cogeneration.
They have something to show.
It's certainly challenging to create a market, but my argument is, well, first of all, it's just beginning. We're in the very early months, even in California, so let's see how it develops. But we need to try and make a market, and I think if we make a market, we'll be very surprised what the outcome is. Because if I could phone up and say, all right, 10 kilowatt hour, and I can phone up my energy efficiency broker and say that I can buy some energy efficiency at 5 kilowatt hour, I know which one I'm going to buy. If I have trust and reliability in that script of energy efficiency, which at the moment there isn't, but you can create a market mechanism that allows people to do that, I think we'd be surprised. Nobody's done it yet. California's just done it.
This is a question for anyone who has an answer. Do the current models account for both total energy, annual energy consumption, as well as demand on say 50 points? So how you invest in energy decisions, so how to stay in the sun. Are those included in mathematical models?
Yeah, they are included, but when you run, it depends for what do you run the model, actually. So when you run the model for decarbonization scenarios, you need to make some assumptions for other parameters. So to know all the details of the but the model could do that, price could do that actually. Just that I don't think for I didn't run the model myself, I'm just using the results from the model. I don't think that for this work we did run the model to answer your question, but it's possible. Yeah.
It can be done, but
yeah, it can be done.
So far, it wasn't the very first one.
No.
Okay, listen, thank you very much. We, as you heard,
This is another
oh, really good one. Yeah.
I'm actually because I think also looking at this whole competitive market of this role-based style of business, and they have been doing this quite well, and the revenue from this whole professional market really help this energy program. So I was wondering, you have also considering, like really considering to launch market so that people can beat their energy into the auctions.
Well, this is what we are hoping with the revision of the internal market regulation, that because among the instruments that we have an internal market directive for electricity and another one for gas, and we have to be revised or reviewed this year. And we are hoping that this is what they will allow. Currently, they don't allow, actually. We don't have, because for example, in Vermont, you have this in the US, but we don't have this in the EU so far. And in the EU, that's why the Energy Union Strategy paper is very important, because it's the first time that we have a policy document which written that energy savings will be, necessary will be done to make energy savings competing on equal basis with the power generation. So it's the first time that we have this in our document. But it's something that we are hoping to achieve this year.
If I may contribute, the prime reason for the voting agreement and energy efficiency in industry and steam was to postpone investments in electricity power, and then they started that program. And the program, the voting agreement steam also focused in first instance in electricity sales. We also have fuel sales as additional benefit. But as it wasn't with the investments.
And this is where measurement becomes particularly important.
Exactly. But now we have, for example, in the Energy Efficiency Directive, we have one article about demand response, one. So we have demand response. It's in the Energy Efficiency Directive since 2012. So it's new for us. But for example, part of we have a resistance, for example, in the building community about considering buildings as energy producer and part of the energy system. And actually, it's a mistake to resist to that, because if it's part of the energy system, so it's part of the infrastructure, and if it's part of the infrastructure, so it's treated differently in investment policies. So we'll have more money for energy innovation if it's part of the energy system. Plus, anyway, buildings will be producing part of the energy, not everything. So there is a resistance, but all these concepts are completely new for us, actually. So that's why we need to, we don't know how to make it work, and we need to talk about it, to communicate about it.
Thank you very much. And we've heard best practice policies across all sectors, and we heard a focus on the industrial sector, and now we've just heard about the challenges in the EU as they try and meet and contribute to this Paris and climate agreement. So certainly big challenges ahead, isn't it? I just wanted to finish off with a couple of takeaway messages from the session. There we go. A couple of key takeaways. So you've heard, I think what's happened now is that we've had sort of 3 or 4 sessions that's focused on energy efficiency, on best practices, knowledge management systems. The next section is going to transition into EU directives. So I just wanted some takeaways from up to the point now. And I guess the first one was that you've heard that there's an array of activities and collaborative opportunities that exist that countries and private sector and other partners can tap into. I've certainly heard about a lot of knowledge and analytical tools that exist and available for policy development and implementation. Robust data and policy evaluation are critical. We've heard the importance of having good data to direct where the policies takes place and where it's prioritised, but also the importance of evaluation to expand programs and for other countries to then adopt it. Certainly ambitious policies are needed to overcome barriers. And best practices already exist and can be adapted to local context. So you've heard lots of examples across all sectors just now about the industrial sector, and there's lots of opportunities to then adopt best practice policies from particular sectors into different countries and cities. And certainly, as the name serves, of this workshop, holistic approach to accelerating energy efficiency action, certainly a holistic approach looking at the whole of socio-economic factors and other factors in the different countries and cities is important and critical to what action happens. And as you see, we're moving to a phase of implementation. You've all got some level of interest and participation in implementation of energy efficiency policies. So we wish you luck, and just from the Copenhagen Centre's point of view, thank you so much for your participation in the workshop so far. I really enjoyed your enthusiasm, your questions, your discussion, and really appreciated partnering with the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. So this afternoon session, Paolo is going to take through the energy efficiency directives from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, focusing on Article 7. So I encourage everyone to stick around. I'll certainly look forward to the next session, Paolo. And I thought that you could join me in thanking all of the presenters, and then what I'd like to do is try and grab a quick photo out there on the overlooking the city, if that's okay. So just join me in thanking all of the presenters and your